very organised. Players are going to be actively engaged. Activities need to be interesting and challenging. I mentioned before trying to get them out of their comfort zone. We often refer to constraints training. So again, as we start to go from whether we want to go with just drills or we want to go more in some small-sided games, we need to consider three variables: who your players are, and some of those aspects can be fatigue, confidence, height, knowledge, skills, fitness, etc. The task itself. So what's the aim of this particular task? What rules am I going to incorporate? How long am I going to go for? What field dimensions? Am I going to go 4 on 5? Am I going to go 6 on 6? Am I going to go 2 on 1? What equipment am I going to use, etc. I can vary. I can manipulate those things. The other aspect that we can manipulate at times or we need to consider is environment. Wind, ground noise. Do we ever train where there's noise, spectators? It's muddy. Or do we always train when it's sunshine and those sorts of things? They're all going to influence learning and performance. So an example would be when we look at those three things, so devise a game or activity, and we might manipulate size of the field, number of players, time, so it might be possession for 60 seconds regardless of whether you drop the ball or not. You keep going for your 60 seconds, then turnover. 3 passes before scoring, you might have as far as rules. Do you want the players in a fatigued or an unfatigued state? How do you want the environment? You can manipulate the pace, the space, or the skill to actually increase their learning. How much time do we spend thinking about those things rather than going back to, this is the drill I'm going to do because it worked last year? Chances are last year was a different team, different players, different needs. You'll still have your drills and your activities and your games that work well, but you need to be able to modify or vary them when needed. I'm asking as far as you to get used to using more of an implicit learning rather than an explicit learning. Again, if I go back as far as the explicit learning, it's predominantly when the coach told me what to do. I stand here, I do a transfer of weight, arms go from here, I follow through, those types of things. It's going to be explicit. If you break down the skill and tell them how to do it, it's explicit. If we start to go through where you're just going to give them a couple of the rules or a couple of things they need to know so they don't hurt themselves, but they then try to work it out, we're going more as far as that implicit way of learning. And if you go back to most of the backyard footy, it's where kids learnt implicitly. They worked it out for themselves. They worked out their own rules. They worked out what worked and what didn't work. And eventually that just became subconscious and automatic. But then certainly now coaches have come in, and often it's a case that parents won't let kids go down the park and just play. It's got to be a structured training session, there's got to be adults there, there's got to be rules, etc. So we need to be careful both as far as the implicit, explicit, and also how much deliberate play we're actually allowing the players. The research will indicate that learning skills implicitly are performed better under pressure and when there's an audience. We tend not to go with a paralysis by analysis. It often happen if you're taught explicitly. They're more resistant under fatigue. But again, for a coach, it's often a case of needing to take more time as far as their planning is concerned. Use of analogies rather than getting very technical. So we're not worried too much as far as whether 2 or 3 of your players kick differently, providing they're not going to injure themselves, or after the result and for them to work out what's the best technique or form for them. We tend to chunk information. Again, try to go visual as far as the analogies are concerned. Interestingly, as far as questioning, we have very little questioning as far as coaches are concerned. On average, there'll tend to be 3 or 4 questions in a training session. Often they won't be open-ended. As far as the structuring of practice, we need to work out what the goal is. Do we have an aim for practice, and do we have an aim for every single thing that we do? As long as we do, then that's fine, and we can hopefully align that. Are you aware as far as how much structured or unstructured practice is in a game of rugby league? Does that reflect how much time you spend at training? So if there's only a set number of scrums in a game that you're likely to get possession from, how much time do you spend practicing that particular scrum play? Compared to a lot of the unstructured, what's in front of you type situation. I've mentioned before as far as practice, and it's a case of, again, what they refer to, certainly in the talent code, as far as deep practice. If they're in their comfort zone, chances are they're not learning. If you're doing the same things that you did before, how can we continue to grow? We need to make it that little bit more difficult. We need to challenge. We need to force some errors and then get them to learn from them. Why didn't that quite work there? So that might be adjusting where the defence is. Might be a case of time, adding more pressure, pace, etc. But the trick is to choose a goal just beyond your present abilities. If it's too far away, it's too easy, we don't grow. So it's working out where that is. When we structure training, and I won't go too much here in case there's some in the next session, but again, trying to get to the small-sided type games where we're trying to get repetition without repetition. So can you devise a particular game where there's enough opportunity for you to be able to make decisions quite a lot, or for you to have to pass or run or tackle or whatever the case may be, without it just being a drill type situation where you know what is coming up. So again, we're trying to incorporate more of that decision making. We're getting away from the traditional coaching. We want them to work it out. So we need to put pressure into your training sessions. At times you need to have unstructured games. Let them play. Let them work it out. That'll emphasise learning the skill and not a particular drill. I mentioned before as far as the questioning. So some of the suggestions then is the when, what, where, why or which. And they may be related to time. So when should you do something? Where is, if it's as far as space is concerned. It might be a risk, so you're asking them what option may be best at a particular or situation. It might be about execution. So how can you? What's the best option, etc. Coaches tend not to be as comfortable with questions, particularly open questions, because you don't know the answer. You don't know what they're going to come back to you with. You've got less control over the situation. But if you've thought about and developed your questions beforehand, you're still going to be facilitating and guiding them in the direction that you want them to go. It does take more time. Telling is certainly a lot quicker, but the learning's a lot slower. So just examples, some of the individual player questions. So again, if they're in a situation in training, you might just ask a particular player, or if they're interchanging as they go through, when was the best time to pass? What was your best option there? What would you have done there? How will the score affect? So it's 5-3, what happens if it was 4-1? Team-based questions you'll tend to ask as far as its stoppages you can do on the run. But strategy guiding questions and scenario questions are going to assist your players in their decision making. Don't you make the decisions for them. So some of the guidelines for feedback: catch players doing things correctly, focus on the cans as well as the cannots, their strengths, not just their weaknesses. Improving people